Robert watched the rescue boat arrive, but his first word wasn't a cry for help. It was a name the sea had already decided to keep. Tonight, we enter the silence that follows a choice you can never take back. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tales of the Darkness. Lower the lights. Stay where you are. If something in your house feels slightly off tonight, don't check it yet. Just listen. Story 1. The swim everyone believed. In my name is Robert, and the first thing I noticed when they pulled me onto the rescue boat was that nobody asked if I was hurt. They asked who was missing. Hands grabbed my wrists, dragged me over the edge, rolled me onto the deck, and I heard voices speaking fast over the wind. One name repeated like a signal. His name, and the way they said it told me they already understood the answer they were about to get. I tried to sit up, tried to point back toward the water, but my arms were too heavy and my throat burned from salt and panic. And when I finally forced out words, all I could say was that he swam, that he left the hull, that he said he would get help, and the deck went quiet for a second. That felt wrong. Nobody argued. Nobody called it brave. Nobody acted surprised. They just looked past me, scanning the surface as if they were looking for something they knew they might not find. The sun was high and harsh. The sea looked almost calm from a distance, but close up it kept shifting, lifting, pushing, pulling, never letting anything stay in one place. And as they turned the boat in slow circles, I watched their faces change from urgency to measurement. They weren't searching with hope anymore. They were calculating how long he had been in, how far he could have gone, how fast the current was dragging everything away from shore. And their calm was worse than panic, because calm meant they were already building a conclusion. They wrapped me in a blanket that smelled like fuel and wet rope and sat me against the cabin wall, and I listened to the radio crackle with coordinates while I tried to remember every detail from the moment the engine failed. The engine hadn't died dramatically. It had just refused us, a weak sputter that faded into nothing, and we had pulled the cord until our hands slipped, until our shoulders shook, until we were panting and still hearing that same useless half-turn. The boat had been low in the water even before the waves started coming over the sides, and once the water got inside it didn't leave. It collected at our feet like the boat was swallowing. The guides spoke urgently, kept pointing toward shore, kept repeating the same thing in broken phrases we barely understood. Swim now, now, now. And the last time I saw them, they were already moving away, their heads low, arms cutting through the water with the kind of rhythm that comes from fear and experience. We stayed with the boat because the boat felt like a decision we could delay, and delaying felt safer than choosing the ocean. We bailed water for hours, not because it helped, but because the act of bailing kept our minds busy. And when the boat finally flipped, it happened with the speed of something that had been waiting for the right angle. One moment we were standing, the next the world was water and noise and disorientation, and when I surfaced, I found him near me, already grabbing the overturned hull like he had practiced it. He strapped a fuel canister to himself, then another, and he kept looking toward shore as if his eyes could pull it closer. They asked me again on the rescue boat how far we were from land when he left, and I told them the truth. I didn't know anymore because distance at sea lies to you. The shoreline stays the same size until it suddenly doesn't exist. I told them he was a strong swimmer. I told them he was confident. I told them he believed he could do it, and even as I said those words, I heard how useless they sounded against the sea. The crew kept sweeping the horizon, one man with binoculars, another pointing, another calling out directions, and I kept staring at the water expecting to see something break the surface ahead, An arm, a floating canister, anything. Nothing appeared, and the absence started to feel intentional, as if the sea was refusing to cooperate with the idea of rescue. The longer the search went on, the quieter the crew became, not because they were giving up, but because they were adjusting, switching from rescue to recovery without saying it out loud. When we finally reached shore, a group was already waiting. The two guides had made it, exhausted, shaking, but alive, and their survival made his absence feel even sharper because it proved help had been possible. People moved around me asking the same questions in different voices. What did he say? What did he wear? What time did he leave? And I answered until my tongue felt thick and heavy. And every answer built a clearer picture of a decision that could not be undone. By nightfall, the shoreline was lined with lamps and radios, and men walking in tight groups, scanning the water with lights that looked weak against the dark. Aircraft circled above, engines droning, flares occasionally streaking the sky, and each flare made the beach look like a staged scene for a moment. Faces lit, eyes turned toward the same empty distance. I stood there, wrapped in a borrowed jacket, watching the light move across waves, and I kept thinking about how small a swimmer looks in the open sea, how quickly a person becomes a point, how easily that point disappears. People talked to me about survival windows, about currents, about the temperature of the water, and I listened, not because I needed education, but because I needed something to hold on to while the hours kept passing. Every time a boat came in and reported nothing found, the group waiting on the sand got quieter, and I noticed how quickly humans start arranging themselves around disappointment. The next day, more resources arrived, more men, more boats, more authority, and the tone shifted, because now it wasn't just a missing person, it was a missing person who mattered to people with reach. The search expanded, widened, became relentless, and still the water stayed empty, and that emptiness started to feel like a statement. I was asked to repeat the story again to new faces who arrived with cameras and notebooks and clean shoes, people who looked at me like I was a piece of evidence. They wanted details I hadn't thought about, the direction of drift, the angle of the sun, the time between the boat flipping and his decision to swim, and I gave them everything I could, because if I didn't give them something, the silence would fill the space. When they asked me why he left, I told them he couldn't stand waiting anymore, that he believed action was safer than stillness, and I watched them write it down as if it explained anything. It didn't, because the truth was simpler and worse. He left because he was sure he could win against distance, and once someone believes that, nothing you say will stop them. At night, I lay awake on a cot in a crowded room listening to people whispering about him, about his family, about how long a human can swim, and the whispers felt like they were trying to reduce him to a rumor before the search even ended. The next morning, I went back to the shore and watched boats leave in formation, and I kept staring at the line where sea meets sky, because that line is where hope goes to become thin. Days passed, and the search turned into routine, and routine is dangerous because it makes loss feel normal. Each day began with plans and ended with reports, and the reports kept repeating the same fact: nothing found, no sign, no trace. People started saying drowned more often, not as a guess, but as a way to keep the situation from staying open, because open endings make people restless. I heard officials speak to the family in low, controlled tones, saw the way they avoided direct language, and I understood they were preparing them for acceptance while still pretending to search. I kept asking myself where the line was, the exact moment the swim stopped being possible, and I hated that I couldn't locate it. There was no scream, no wave that marked it, no witness, just time, distance, and a body moving forward until it couldn't. The ocean doesn't provide closure. It doesn't return explanations. It simply continues, and that is what made the whole thing feel unfinished even when everyone started treating it as finished. Weeks later, when I was finally sent home, people asked me to tell the story like it had an ending, like it reached a point where you could stop thinking about it. I couldn't do that, because the last image I had of him wasn't panic or failure, it was intention. A man turning away from a floating hull and committing to open water like it was a plan he had already tested in his mind. That is the part that keeps returning, the certainty in his movement, the way his strokes stayed consistent until distance erased him, and how quickly the world around him moved from rescue to explanation. Even now, when I hear a radio crackle or see a flare in the sky, I feel that deck under my back again, and I hear his name being repeated by strangers who had never met him but already needed him to be found. People like to believe the sea is empty because emptiness feels safer than the idea of something being lost without anyone seeing it happen. I know better, because I watched a person vanish in plain sight, not behind trees or walls, but on open water, under open sky, while everyone believed in the swim just long enough for the chance of return to quietly close. If you want more stories like these, subscribe to Tales of Darkness. Daniel believed the sea respected confidence. He was wrong. Story 2. The boat that wouldn't stop drifting. My name is Daniel, and the last time I saw him alive, he was standing on the edge of a boat that was already failing us. The engine had gone silent minutes earlier, not with a bang or a cough, but with a weak sputter that faded until there was nothing left to restart. We pulled the cord again and again, hands slipping, arms burning, listening to the motor refuse us in small, humiliating bursts. And every second we wasted felt heavier than the one before because the water around us was changing. The surface wasn't calm, it wasn't violent either. It was restless, uneven, the kind of movement that never lets you settle, and I remember realizing too late that the boat was drifting faster than it looked. We weren't close to shore anymore, not close enough to feel safe, and the current kept pulling us away with steady patience. The boat itself was wrong for this situation, two narrow hulls tied together, low in the water, never meant to sit still in rough conditions, and as waves rolled in they didn't crash, they climbed, spilling over the sides and collecting at our feet. At first we laughed it off, joked about bailing water like it was a game, but that stopped when we noticed the level wasn't dropping. It was rising, slowly, quietly, without urgency, the way something fills when it knows it has time. He kept looking toward the shore, squinting, measuring distance with his eyes like it was something he could solve if he stared long enough, and I remember thinking he looked calmer than he should have been. He was always like that, calm in moments that should have forced panic, confident in ways that made you trust him, even when your instincts disagreed. The guide spoke to us in quick, urgent sentences we barely understood, pointing toward the land, pointing at the water, pointing back at the boat, and the meaning was clear even without words. We were running out of options. They said the swim was possible now, not later, that waiting would make it impossible. And they said it with a certainty that didn't invite debate. I didn't like the idea of abandoning the boat, didn't like the idea of leaving supplies behind, didn't like the idea of choosing open water over something that still floated, even badly, but the way the guide spoke made it clear this wasn't about preference anymore. He hesitated, not because he was afraid, but because he was calculating, weighing loss against risk, and that hesitation cost us more distance than we could afford. In the end, the decision was split. The guides went first, slipping into the water without ceremony, striking out toward shore with strong, practiced strokes, and we stayed behind, watching them shrink against the surface until they were just movement, then just direction. The silence after they left was immediate and uncomfortable, broken only by water sloshing against wood and the faint sound of the current pulling us farther out. We started bailing in earnest then, scooping water with whatever we could find, not because it worked, but because doing nothing felt worse, and every time I looked down the waterline felt closer to my knees. Hours passed like that, hands raw, muscles shaking, the sun climbing higher, and still no sign of help, no sign that the guides had made it, no sound except the boat slowly losing the argument. When the wave hit, it didn't announce itself, it didn't roar, it just arrived at the wrong angle and tipped everything over like it had been waiting for the right moment. The world flipped, water rushed in, and suddenly I was underwater, disoriented, swallowing panic along with salt. I surfaced gasping and found the boat upside down, floating just enough to grab, and I clung to it like it was solid ground. He surfaced near me, eyes wide but focused, already reaching for anything that could help us stay up, and when he found the fuel canister and tied it to himself, I remember thinking how strange it was that even then he was planning ahead. We hung there together, arms hooked over the hull, legs kicking occasionally to keep balance, and the hours stretched into something shapeless. The sun dropped, the water cooled, and the night came without warning, bringing with it a different kind of fear, the quiet kind that leaves room for thoughts you don't want. By morning we were exhausted, barely speaking, conserving energy, and still no help. He started talking then, calmly, like he was discussing weather, explaining that if help hadn't come yet it might not come at all, that waiting longer would only weaken us, and that the swim, as impossible as it sounded, was still a chance. I argued, told him the distance was too far now, told him the current was against us, told him it was madness, but he didn't raise his voice, didn't rush his words. He just kept repeating that doing nothing would kill us. When he stood up in the water and adjusted the canister around his waist, I felt something drop in my chest, because the way he moved told me he had already decided. He shook my hand firmly, looked me straight in the eyes, and told me to hold on, that he would get help, that it would take time, but it would come. Then he turned away and started swimming, strong, deliberate strokes cutting into the water, and I watched him move farther from the boat with every breath I took. At first he stayed visible, his head rising and falling rhythmically, and I counted the strokes without realizing I was doing it. Then distance softened him, then flattened him, and eventually he was just a point of movement against endless water. And then even that disappeared. I stayed there alone, gripping the overturned hull, listening to the sea work around me, and the longer I waited, the more wrong everything felt. Time lost shape, night returned, and still no help, and it wasn't until the flare lit the sky hours later that I realized how long I had been waiting. The rescue came quickly after that. Voices, hands, solid surfaces, and the first question I asked wasn't about myself, it was about him. When they told me no one had seen him, that the guides had made it to shore but he had never arrived, the words didn't land right away, they just hung there, unreal. Even now, what stays with me is not the fear of the water or the exhaustion or the cold. It's the image of him swimming away with complete certainty, convinced the distance could be beaten if he respected it enough. And the thought that sometimes the thing that pulls you under isn't panic or weakness, it's confidence, quiet and steady, telling you to keep going long after the moment to stop has passed. Story 3. The footage that shouldn't exist. My name is Alan, and I was not supposed to find anything because what I was doing wasn't a search, it was a review. The footage had been sitting untouched for years, boxed and labeled like something already finished, and my job was simply to log it, check quality, and move on. I remember pressing play without expectation, leaning back in the chair, already thinking about what I would do next, and that mindset is important because it meant I wasn't looking for answers. I wasn't chasing mystery. I was relaxed, careless even. The images were ordinary at first. Wide shots of water, distant shorelines, boats moving slowly across the frame. The kind of material nobody rewatches unless they have a reason. Minutes passed, then more minutes, and I started fast-forwarding, stopping occasionally when something moved close enough to fill the frame, then skipping again. That's when I noticed the canoe. It entered from the edge of the image so slowly that I almost missed it, a dark shape against bright water, moving with purpose but without urgency. I stopped the footage and rewound, then played it again at normal speed, watching the canoe slide into view, watching the figures inside it remain still as if they knew exactly where they were going. At first it looked like nothing more than a group traveling together. But the longer I watched, the more one detail refused to settle, one figure that did not match the others. He was lighter, not just in skin, but in posture, in the way his body moved among theirs, and even from a distance, it stood out. I leaned forward, adjusted the screen, slowed the playback, and the feeling in my chest shifted from mild interest to alert attention, because the more I focused on him, the more wrong he felt in that setting. He was naked like the others, but his movements lacked the same rhythm. His balance seemed slightly off, as if he had learned to stand that way recently. I watched his head turn, watched his shoulders tense, watched him grip the edge of the canoe with a familiarity that didn't feel practiced, and I realized I was holding my breath. I rewound again, zoomed in as much as the quality allowed, and the image degraded into grain and blur. But even through that distortion, his presence was undeniable. This was not someone passing through, not someone being transported unwillingly. This was someone placed among them, accepted enough to sit there without restraint, and that detail carried more weight than anything else in the frame. I checked the timestamp, checked the real number, checked the notes attached to the box, and nothing explained it. The footage had been shot incidentally, no emphasis, no commentary, just a passing capture of something that was never meant to be examined. I watched the canoe move farther across the frame until it disappeared, and when it did, I realized my hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the recognition that I had seen something I was not prepared to process. I didn't tell anyone immediately, not because I was hiding it, but because I needed to be sure I wasn't imagining significance where there was none. I replayed the sequence again and again, adjusting contrast, isolating frames, comparing body shapes, and each time the same conclusion returned. This figure did not belong to the environment in any ordinary way. I pulled reference images, compared outlines, compared proportions, and while nothing was clear enough to confirm identity, the resemblance was strong enough to unsettle me. What bothered me most was not the possibility of recognition, it was the context, The fact that this footage existed at all, captured casually, without reaction, without explanation. If this was who it appeared to be, then the story everyone accepted was incomplete, and incompleteness at that scale is dangerous because it invites questions nobody is ready to answer. I finally called in a colleague and asked him to watch without telling him what to look for, and I observed his reaction carefully. At first, he said nothing, then he leaned forward, then he paused the video himself and asked to see it again, and when he finally spoke, he didn't say a name, he asked a question, asking whether that was supposed to be there. That was enough confirmation for me, because it meant the reaction wasn't personal, it was structural. Something about the image triggered doubt naturally. Word spread quickly after that, not because we pushed it, but because once something like this enters a space, it doesn't stay contained. People watched, rewatched, argued, speculated, and every conversation ended in the same place, uncertainty paired with discomfort. Some said it was coincidence, others said it was a different individual, others said the quality made it impossible to know anything for sure, and all of them were correct in a way that didn't help. The footage didn't provide answers, it provided instability. It reopened something that had been closed neatly for decades. What made it worse was how ordinary the moment was. No dramatic framing, no emphasis, just a passing capture of a canoe crossing water, and that ordinariness suggested this scene was not exceptional where it occurred, only where it was viewed. I began to think about how many moments like this exist unexamined, how many truths pass through lenses without anyone stopping to ask what they are seeing. The more attention the footage received, the more pressure built around it, and with pressure came warnings. I received calls advising caution, messages suggesting silence, reminders that some stories are better left settled, and while none of them were overt threats, the implication was clear. Pursuing this line of inquiry would not be welcomed. That reaction told me more than any analysis could, because people don't discourage curiosity unless it risks disturbing something that has been carefully arranged. I stopped watching the footage after a while, not because it lost its power, but because it gained too much of it. The image followed me outside the editing room, appeared in idle moments, returned when I least expected it, and every time it did the same question surfaced. Not who was that, but how long had this been visible without being seen? The canoe crossing the frame became a marker in my mind, a dividing line between what was believed and what was possible, and once that line exists, it can't be erased. Even now, when I think about that sequence, what unsettles me most is not the figure himself, but the fact that he wasn't hidden, he was right there, moving through open space, captured casually, and dismissed for years because no one had been ready to look closely enough. The footage did not prove anything conclusively, and that is exactly why it mattered, because certainty would have allowed closure, and closure would have allowed forgetting. Instead, it left a gap, a space where explanation should be, and that space keeps pulling attention back to it again and again, like something unfinished asking to be noticed. Story 4. What the river keeps. My name is Thomas, and the first warning I ever received about that river didn't come from a sign or a map. It came from the way people stopped talking when I mentioned it. I had arrived weeks after everything had already been explained away, after the search had ended, after the story had been folded neatly into a version that allowed everyone to move on, and my job was simple: gather remaining statements, close remaining gaps, make sure nothing had been missed. On paper, it was routine, just another follow-up, but from the moment I started asking questions, I could feel resistance that didn't match the simplicity of the assignment. Locals answered politely but briefly, eyes drifting away before sentences finished, hands finding excuses to stay busy, and the same phrase kept repeating in different mouths: "The river takes what it takes." At first I thought it was just superstition, a way people justify accidents they don't want to think about. But the more I heard it, the more intentional it sounded, less like belief and more like instruction. I walked the shoreline early one morning, following the current with my eyes, watching how debris moved, how branches caught and released, how the surface never behaved the same way twice, and it was clear immediately that this wasn't a place that gave anything back easily. The water didn't rush violently. It moved steadily, confidently, like it knew exactly where everything inside it was going. I spoke to fishermen who had worked these waters for decades, and none of them would give me straight answers, only fragments, mentions of things seen and then not seen again, references to shapes that appeared downstream days later where they should not have been able to travel. When I asked directly about the man who swam away from the boat, their reactions shifted, shoulders tightening, voices lowering, and one of them told me quietly that once the river accepts someone, it doesn't like being questioned about it. That sentence stayed with me because it suggested intention, not chaos, and intention is not something people usually assign to water unless experience has forced them to. I reviewed reports late into the night, reading the same conclusions repeated with slight variations: drowned during the swim, body not recovered, search terminated due to conditions, and every line felt designed to end discussion rather than explain events. There were gaps in the timeline that had been filled with assumptions, distances calculated without witnesses, outcomes assigned without moments, and while none of it was technically wrong, none of it felt complete. I went back to the river at night, standing alone where the water slid past rocks with a low constant sound that felt too regular to be natural, and I watched how reflections moved, how the surface caught light and then swallowed it whole. At one point I thought I saw something break the surface downstream, not a splash, not movement, just a brief interruption in the pattern. And when I focused on it, the pattern closed again like nothing had happened. I told myself it was fatigue, the mind looking for meaning where there was none, but the feeling didn't fade when I turned away. Over the next few days, I heard similar descriptions from different people who had no reason to coordinate, each of them careful with their words, each of them describing interruptions rather than events, moments when the river did something it wasn't supposed to do. One man described seeing a shape caught briefly in an eddy before slipping free. Another mentioned finding equipment downstream far earlier than it should have traveled, and another said he heard shouting once long after the search had ended, distant and muffled, carried strangely by the water. None of them wanted their names attached to statements, and all of them asked whether this inquiry was really necessary, because reopening things never improves the outcome. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that the official story existed to protect routine, not truth. The idea that the swim failed fit neatly into expectations. It allowed people to categorize the event as tragic but understandable, something unfortunate but resolved. The alternative, that something else happened after he disappeared from view, required too many uncomfortable questions, not about danger, but about patience, about what waits when movement stops. I found records of previous incidents along the same stretch of water, all different on the surface, all similar underneath. People entering the river with plans, with confidence, with reasons, and never being recovered despite extensive searches. The language in those reports mirrored this one closely. emphasis on conditions, on currents, on exhaustion, and minimal attention paid to what happened between entry and disappearance. That space was always left empty, as if acknowledging it would invite speculation nobody wanted to manage. One night, while reviewing maps, I noticed how the current funneled toward a narrow section downstream, a place where the river slowed just enough to hold things temporarily before releasing them farther along. When I visited that location the next day, I understood why it was rarely mentioned. The banks there were difficult to access, overgrown, silent, and the water moved with deceptive calm. Standing there, I felt watched, not by something visible, but by the awareness that this was a place where things lingered before deciding where to go next. I stayed longer than planned, telling myself I needed closure, but knowing that closure wasn't really what I was after. I needed to understand why the story felt unfinished, even after everyone agreed on its ending. One evening, as the light faded, I heard a sound from the river that didn't belong to water or wind, something rhythmic, controlled, almost like effort. I followed it downstream, heart racing despite my attempts to stay rational, and the sound stopped the moment I reached the bend. Nothing moved, nothing surfaced, and yet the sense of interruption was undeniable, as if I had arrived in the middle of something that quickly adapted to my presence. That was the moment I realized the river didn't just carry things away, it managed them, decided when to reveal and when to conceal, and that realization made every previous warning make sense. People weren't afraid of superstition. They were afraid of attention, afraid that looking too closely would disturb something that preferred to remain unobserved. When I filed my final report, I followed protocol, repeated the accepted conclusions, and left out everything that could not be proven, because proof requires witnesses, and witnesses require survival. But even as I signed my name, I knew the document was incomplete, another layer added to the same quiet agreement that allows everyone else to sleep at night. I left the area shortly after, but the river followed me in ways I didn't expect. I hear it sometimes in quiet moments, not as sound, but as rhythm, a reminder of movement that never stops, of decisions that continue even after observers leave. When I think about the man who swam away from the boat, I no longer picture him failing or sinking. I picture him reaching that slower section of water, caught between currents, waiting, and realizing too late that not all distances are measured in meters or strokes. Some distances are about time, about how long something can be held before it is allowed to move on, and once the river decides to keep something, asking where it went becomes the wrong question. The right question is why it was never meant to come back at all. Closing Tales of the Darkness. That's it for tonight on Tales of the Darkness. If you're still listening, the silence around you already knows you're there. These stories don't end when the screen goes dark. They stay behind. They watch. They wait. Pay attention to what feels too calm, too easy, too prepared. If you want more stories like this, subscribe to Tales of the Darkness. And remember, keep one eye open. Good night.